Good morning. It is a very good week for us. Lord willing, we will have our in-person midweek Bible study once more. It's been a long time. It's been since the week of March the 15th. And I quit counting how many months a long time ago, and I won't bore you with my inability to do math this morning, but it's been a really long time. And so we are prayerfully looking forward to that time. And if you didn't watch the Wednesday live stream last week, you may not know much about what that's going to look like. There was some details in the email update. Check that out. Basically, we're going to have 3 classes, and those 3 classes will provide for all our members, no matter what age they are. The little ones will be in the fellowship hall. The 5th grade and up, 5th through 12th grade will be in the teen room. And then the rest of us, the adults, will be here in the auditorium studying the inspiration of the Bible. And for those of you at home, you don't worry, we will continue to live stream that. So you'll still get a class at home, but our little ones will get something they haven't had in a long, long time, which is a class for them. A class that teaches them on their level. And we're very excited about that. And we know how important they are. And we want them to continue to grow in the Lord. And so I'm thankful for those who have made it possible for us to come back together. And hopefully that will go well. And then we'll start working on the other services. We're just walking this up as safely as we possibly can. Also keeping in mind our members who have been dealing with the virus. Tim will share that news with you at the end of service. But our hearts are with them, and we want to keep everybody safe and remember them. On Sunday mornings in worship, we've been engaged in a series on Proverbs of the King. This is a good time to think about leadership, authority, and rule. It's an election season in this country, but not only that, we face leadership every day, and all of us have influence to some degree or another. Too many of us take that for granted, and we need to understand how important our various leadership roles are and God's will for us in those roles. I want to start by returning to something I've said, I think, in the introduction of every one of these lessons, which is the role of the king is to represent God on earth. As long as a king is transparent to God and receptive to God's authority, he is a successful leader. Now, who is this God that he's supposed to be representing? How do we describe him? You could boil down the attributes of God into 3 categories. You've seen it various ways, but here's one way to do it. You could break it down into 3 categories. The first is his omnipotence. That is, he can do anything he wills. Job said in Job 42 verse 2, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. When God wills something, it will certainly happen. His omnipotence. That encompasses a lot of his activity. The second category is his steadfast love. That is expressed by a very important Hebrew term in the Old Testament, chesed, translated in most places, steadfast love. And it has to do with God's complete loyalty to his people. He never lets us down. That encompasses a lot of his activity as well. The third and final category is his immutability. And I realize that's not a familiar term, but it just means that he doesn't change. I, the Lord, change not. Malachi 3:6. With the Father there is no variation or change, shadow due to change. James chapter 1 verse 17. God does not change. Some people would say, well, where is his righteousness? Where is his holiness? That's covered under the category of his immutability, because God's righteousness just describes who he is. And the immutability says He will always be righteous. He will be unfailingly holy. That never changes. And so think about that. What does the king represent? The king is meant to represent God's omnipotence, His power. He is meant to represent His steadfast love and also, finally, His immutability. Now, all of those attributes are summed up in Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 17 through 19. Look at it. Jeremiah says, "Ah, Lord God, it is you who have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you." Do you see the omnipotence of God in that first statement? So next, Jeremiah says, "You show steadfast love to thousands." There's the second category, His steadfast love. But then he says finally, "But you repay the guilt of fathers to their children after them." In other words, He doesn't show partiality. He doesn't discriminate. His righteousness applies to everybody, no matter who they are. His holiness applies to everyone. He will be a fair and righteous judge, and that will never change. And so you have those three qualities, those categories rather, His omnipotence, His steadfast love, and His immutability, all wrapped up in that prophecy of Jeremiah 32, verses 17 and 18. Now, the king is supposed to represent that. And so we're going to wrap up this series with two of those categories. This morning talking about the power of the king, and next week talking about the steadfast love of the king. The title for this morning's lesson is The Growling Lion. That's an image in Proverbs of the authority vested in a ruler or a leader. And then next week's lesson, Lord willing, as we wrap this up, is called The Loving Builder, and we'll talk about that steadfast love that should shine through any good leader of any group of people. So let's talk today about the growling lion, and we've got three headings to discuss as we think about it. Here's the first one, the power of the lion. That leads us to our text, Proverbs chapter 20. If you turn over there, notice verse 2, which reads, "The terror of a king is like the growling of a lion. Whoever provokes him to anger forfeits his life." This is expressing common sense. Someone with authority like a king, or even someone with the authority of a father, or of a leader of an organization, or your boss at work. He or she must be approached very carefully. He or she must be respected, right? Because if you provoke that person to anger, in the words of the Proverbs, you forfeit your life. Now, maybe not your physical life, but it may be your employment life. It may be your life as a member of that organization. Kids, it may be your life as being fun, and you may be grounded for a month. But if you provoke the one in authority to anger, just know you're facing a growling lion, and you forfeit your life. Literally, the wording there, express forfeit your life, is sins against himself. You're doing it to yourself because it is a given in society that someone in a position of authority, someone holding an office of authority, has that terror, has that power. There are many other passages that say the same thing. For example, look at Proverbs 16:14. "A king's wrath is a messenger of death, and a wise man will appease it." If you're wise, you will seek not to anger the king. Don't poke the lion with a stick. That's the idea there. Look at Proverbs 19, verse 12. "A king's wrath," here's the image again, "is like the growling of a lion, but his favor is like the dew on the grass." There are two sides to him. He's not all mean. If you please him, if you follow authority, if you submit to the proper system that God has ordained on earth, the favor of that system can be like dew on the grass. And then I found this in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 4. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place. And look at this advice. For calmness will lay great offenses to rest. So if you've angered the leader, make yourself scarce for a little while. I thought that was really interesting. The word calmness is literally health. So your peace, your quiet, your silence in the face of the king is maybe your health or his health. I don't know which is intended, but it calms the whole situation down. Don't provoke the growling lion, because there is power in the office. Now, I can't think of the king as a growling lion without being reminded of the Chronicles of Narnia. I don't know if you've been thinking about this, but I think of C.S. Lewis's character in the Chronicles of Narnia. I think it's a 7-book set in which this character appears every time. The character is called Aslan, and it represents Christ in this fantasy world that Lewis created. And he was asked one time, why a lion? And he said this, he said, since Narnia is a world of talking beasts, I thought that Christ would come as a talking beast, as he became a man here on earth. He said, I pictured him becoming a lion there because A, the lion is supposed to be the king of the beasts. B, Christ is called the Lion of Judah in the Bible. And C, I'd been having strange dreams about lions when I began writing the work. I think it's a perfect symbol of Christ because he is referred to as the Lion of Judah. And prophecy describes him as such in Genesis 49, verse 9. And so you have this fascinating character in the Chronicles of Narnia. Many of you are familiar with it. And this lion is fierce. He's not one to cuddle up with people. He's a warrior. He has great, terrifying authority. In fact, there's one scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe where the children in the book ask about this lion and ask if he is safe. And the answer is, of course he's not safe. Who said anything about being safe? But he's good. He's the king. And there's the idea that we're trying to get across here from Proverbs 20, verse 2 and other passages, is the king by design is not meant to be safe. But that doesn't mean he's evil or bad. He's dangerous. Approaching him may be perilous, and at the same time, he's good. I know we struggle with that idea, and it's perfectly normal to struggle with that because we usually look at danger and peril as something that is bad for us. But in this case, it's good for there to be power. It's good for there to be offices of authority that wield tremendous amount of wrath and terror. That is a system God has put into place. And we see this because the wise man matches the legitimacy of fearing God with the legitimacy of fearing the king. Look at Proverbs 24, verses 21 and 22. My son, fear the Lord and the king. You see that? Fear the Lord and also at the same time fear the king. It's tied together, the same fear. Do not join with those who do otherwise. You want to overthrow systems of government, for example. For disaster will arise suddenly from them, and who knows the ruin that will come from them both. So the picture here is without government, without order, without power and authority, a business, a family, a government, a church is going to crumble and it's going to fall. That's the way God made this world. I think this says it all in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. Peter is writing to a group of people probably living in the city of Rome under the horrible reign of the Emperor Nero. Yet he says, honor the emperor. And he's talking more about the office than the person. Because as I said, Nero was a tyrannical leader, very dangerous person. And yet, Peter, an apostle, didn't want that office to crumble because of the person who happened to be sitting there at the time. Society depended on that authority. And so he said, honor the emperor. We're quickly losing our awe for the king. We're quickly losing our ability. You know, we're Americans. America started with a revolution, right, against the king. And we live in a democracy, and we get to put our leaders out of office if we're displeased with them. At least that's the idea. And sometimes we can let that idea go too far and lose respect for the office. And it goes to all points. I'm not just talking about, politics here, but when it comes to the home, when it comes to law and order, when it comes to children's behavior in schools, when it comes to our attitudes towards our employers, we're losing our respect for authority. And friends, according to the wisdom in the book of Proverbs, that's a bad thing. And that will lead to ruin. It will lead to that. How do we learn to respect God? We learn our respect for God through practicing it in the leaders that He has ordained in society. So yes, there is a growling lion. There is the power of the lion that we must look at. In the second place, though, we want to look at also the judgment of the lion. So let's look at that for a few minutes. The judgment of the lion. And this is in Proverbs chapter 20 again, verses 8 and 26. We'll read them together, starting in verse 8. A king who sits on the throne of judgment winnows all evil with his eyes. And then skip down to verse 26. A wise king winnows the wicked and drives the wheel over them. He's using three symbols that are all related here. And the first of these three symbols is the throne. The throne represents the position of authority, or the office, we might say. You might have said before of an elected leader, well, I don't respect him, but I respect the office. That's what the throne represents. There is power inherent in it because it represents the delegated authority ordained by God, the throne. The second imagery here is in verse 26, the wheel. And the wheel crushes the grain on the threshing floor. If you're familiar with the techniques of harvesting and processing wheat in ancient times, they would harvest the wheat and they would bring it to the threshing floor, and then somehow they would have to thrash it. Maybe they would beat it with a thrashing tool. In this case, it was rolled over with a wheel, and it would crush the grain, and that would separate the wheat, the edible part of the grain, from the chaff, which is the husk that's just there for protection, and it's not good for eating. And so that's what's happening there. That's the second symbol. And it has to do with separation, okay? The third symbol is the winnowing fan. You'll see the verb winnow both in verse 8 and in verse 26. After the grain is thrashed or crushed by the wheel, it's tossed by a winnowing fan or a pitchfork or something. And you toss it up in a breezy area, and the wind blows the useless chaff away, and only the heavier edible part of the grain falls to the ground. Then it can be collected up, and it can be turned into flour or used for food or feeding animals or whatever. And so that's the process of discerning the good from the bad. That's a symbol of judgment. And he's talking here about the judgment that a king should have. His discernment, his ability to tell the difference between good and evil, and to make sure in his kingdom that the good wins and the evil loses. Unlike our government, I said this last week, there were no separation of powers. The legislative branch in ancient Israel was the law of Moses, and the executive and judicial branches were combined in the king. And so it was very important for the king to exercise his position with wisdom, because there was a lot depending upon him. And a lot of people would think, well, that requires a lot of power and brute strength. But you'll notice verse 26 does not describe him as the mighty king, does it? But it describes him as the wise king. Because it's wisdom that will make him successful. And any king worth his salt, or any leader worth his salt, knows that the wisdom does not come from within him, but from God. And so in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 26, the wise man says, "Many seek the face of a ruler, but it is from the Lord that the man gets justice." It's from God. And so if you're going to lead properly, you're going to lead while being guided by the hand of the Lord. It's so important for us to remember, without the Word of God, we won't have proper leadership. Rulers have to recognize that. This is what made King David great. In Psalm 9, David is thanking God for all the blessings. He's counting his blessings. And one of the things he thanks God for in verse 4 is the guidance God gave him to make him a successful king. Listen to what he says. "You have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne giving righteous judgment." I can't think of a better statement of what we've been talking about in the role of a king. The role of the king is to be transparent or receptive to the great ultimate king. Well, David says, when it comes down to it, you were sitting on the throne, not me. I was there, but all people saw when I made judgments was you. Now that's a successful king. He recognizes that the wisdom for discernment and judgment is not in himself. He doesn't let his power go to his head, but he realizes, I've been granted this power so that God can reign through me, so God's word can live through me. So a good leader, and again, I'm talking to parents, I'm talking to people who have influence as a friend, I'm talking to you who are young that may lead in various ways, I'm talking about coaches, I'm talking about school teachers, I'm talking about church elders, I'm talking about civic leaders, whatever it is. Probably everybody can learn from this. Your role is to represent God when you're in authority. When you have influence, people must see God through you. And you have to be wise, but you're not going to get that wisdom from within you. The wisdom is in the Word of God. And if you have faith in that Word and you lead by Him, you will be successful. That's the message here. It is right for there to be power in the lion and for there to be judgment in the lion. But let's talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Third place, the failure of the king. Okay, theoretically, it's right. You know, we should have systems of government with power. And parents should wield power over their homes. And there should be power in the workplace. Otherwise, it won't work. But so many leaders are corrupt. So many parents are abusive. So many workplaces are full of all kinds of unfairness and evil. And so how can we even make this information useful? What are we supposed to do with what we see here? The book of Proverbs is not blind to this. It's very clear that every human being is a failure. Look at some of these in chapters 19 and 20, just right around our text. We could comb through the whole book, but I'll just limit myself to a few statements made right around the verses that we've been talking about. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 21. "Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." So we have ideas and we're going to do this and do that, and then all of a sudden, God has a surprise for us. Chapter 20, verse 6. "Many a man proclaims his own steadfast love, but a faithful man who can find?" We talk the talk, but we rarely walk the walk. Only God has that steadfast love. Verse 9, "Who can say, I've made my heart pure? I am clean from my sin." Can any of you say that? that on your own, your entire life, or hey, let's say this entire week, you've made your heart clean? Have you had an evil thought this week? Have you committed sin with your mouth this week? Have you caved to temptation this week? That's humanity for you. It's the failure of the king. Verse 24, a man's steps are from the Lord. How then can man understand his way? Oh, I know people, somebody might brag. A person in a position of authority might say, my way is best. I know how people work. Trust me. You go with my plan and this will work. How can man understand his way when all our steps are from the Lord? This is why power corrupts. You've heard it said, it's true. This is why so many leaders that you've looked up to in the past have disappointed you. This is why judges take bribes. This is why we're so discouraged time and time again, because of the failure of the king. So what's the problem? Is it wrong for leaders to growl? You know, if you're in a leadership position, you might be hesitant to exert your authority, to growl like a lion. There's one of two extremes that occur in the face of these failures that we have. On the one hand, there are leaders that are just way too insecure. They're in a position, but they know their flaws well, and they're afraid to lead, and they let their people down because they're insecure. On the other extreme, you've got leaders who are way too arrogant, full of pride. They let the power go to their head, and they don't consider the will of God or the wisdom in His Word, and so they fumble through their responsibilities on that extreme. I think part of the problem is the way we look at what a leader is supposed to do. I think a lot of the problem is on the followers and our expectations of leadership. You see, I think most of us believe that a leader is supposed to take information and use that information to control reality, to manipulate the world. Think about it. You've probably thought this before. You're probably thinking it now. I know that I've thought it in many times, even in my own role as a preacher. I've thought, what I'm supposed to do is to learn the best way, say, to make a church grow or to lead a person to Christ, and then use that information to make it happen. I see it all the time. We set goals. And it's okay to set goals. The question is, what's the motive behind it? We set goals. We're going to have this number of people by the end of 2021. We're going to accomplish this many things by the end of the year. We're going to do this by putting this plan that we've come up with into action. We think the role of a leader is to lead and to manage and to make things happen, right? We're missing the point. We don't have that much power. And God didn't give us power to do that. To be more exact, here is what we're supposed to do with the power and with the judgment. It's not about getting information to control reality. It's about gaining wisdom to navigate reality successfully. I know that almost sounds like the same thing, but think about it very carefully. There's a difference between getting information to control reality, because then you're putting yourself in the place of God, and gaining wisdom to navigate it successfully. There you lead by faith and dependence on the true King, the ultimate King. Now, a leader who's successful in the home and anywhere else is going to do it that way. And that's why Paul was a very powerful person, inspired apostle. He said, I planted, Apollos watered, but neither one of us is in control. God gave the growth. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. There's a great illustration of this in a business management book that many of you have probably read. If you've been through business school or you're trying to improve yourself, it's a self-help book called Good to Great. Okay, Good to Great is a best-selling book by Jim Collins on business strategy. And what he did in 2001 is he took 11 businesses and he watched how they went from good to great. And he gave lessons on business strategy from these 11 businesses. Now in 2020, it's kind of humorous to look back on these good to great companies. One of them is Circuit City. Remember Circuit City, where service is state of the art? A lot of you were born after Circuit City. It is Circuit City now. Circuit City went under. 2008, they were gone. Another one on his list, Fannie Mae. Do you remember Fannie Mae? And all the bad debt that they accrued and all the bad loans that they gave out? They weren't a great company after all. But if you bought Good to Great in 2001, they were the example. Circuit City was an example of how to run a business, how to use that power, how to use that information to control the environment. And as it turns out, a lot of successful businesses combine knowledge with a lot of luck. They just happen to be in the right place at the right time. I'm not saying that you shouldn't learn about business. I'm just saying the motive and the approach is better when you realize that you're not in full control and you can't predict the future. And no one really knows ultimately what's going on but God. Because none of us is the true king. None of us is the true king. If you want to see the real lion, turn to Revelation chapter 5. Let's go over to Revelation 5. John is in a predicament. He sees this scroll. And on the scroll are 7 seals. And he wants to know. Everybody wants to know what's written in the scroll, because what is in the scroll is sacred information, secret information that will make man whole. But no one has been found who's worthy to open the scroll. So we start reading Revelation chapter 5, verse 1. He sees in the right hand of him seated on the throne, in the right hand of God, a scroll written within and on the back sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" Not even the strong angel can do it. And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I, this is John, began to weep loudly, because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. Now look at verse 5. And one of the elders, see, that's wisdom. Young folks, the elders are the wise. The older people are to be respected and appreciated and valued because they've been through it all. And so in Revelation, when an elder speaks, and that goes for the position of an elder, but I'm talking about an older person, okay? When an elder speaks, people listen because the older people, they know. And so John listened, and one of the elders said, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. And then we get to see him. And what does he look like? Look at verse 6. Remember all that we read in the book of Proverbs and compare it to what it comes down to in verse 6. Between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb. He's a lion, but he's also a lamb, standing as though it had been slain, with 7 horns, that's important, and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. Only one has the wisdom to open the scroll. Only one is the source, the true lion, the real king. And notice he has these 2 details. He has 7 horns. And the number 7 indicates perfection. And you know what a horn stands for? This is a consistent symbol in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It always stands for power. Remember the first point we talked about, the power of the lion? This lion has 7 horns. Secondly, he has 7 eyes. Do you remember the judge in Proverbs? What did he winnow evil with? His eyes. The eyes stand for discernment. They stand for judgment. And there's 7, meaning perfect judgment. And so we read about the need for the power of the lion and the discernment or the judgment of the lion, and we come to see the revelation of the lion in Revelation chapter 5. And who is it? It's Jesus Christ, and with him is all power, and with him is all discernment. And so all we are vessels for the true and the truly powerful King, the one who judges all. It's a fool who reads the book of Proverbs and thinks that he can handle the responsibility of leadership on his own. And everything makes sense when we see this revelation of the Lamb who was slain, who has the 7 horns and the 7 eyes. What kind of leader do you respect? Now, don't think about it in terms of what kind of leader you aspire to be. That's where our judgment gets cloudy. What kind of leader do you respect? Do you respect an autocratic, all-powerful, non-compromising, hard-fisted ruler? Or do you respect someone who is humble, who is righteous, who is fair, who is receptive to the King? And you know the answer to that. Now, what kind of leader do you aspire to be? What kind of influence do you want to have over your business, over your family, over your church, among your neighbors, at school? Are you going to be one who tries to seize authority, thinking you can control the reality around you? Or are you going to be receptive to the true King and use wisdom to navigate reality successfully? It's a choice you have to make. We all have influence. All of us in some way or another is a growling lion. That's a huge responsibility. And it can't be used safely and rightfully unless we're walking with the King. Are you walking with him? Do you have the lion on your side, the one with 7 horns and 7 eyes, who sees everything, the omnipotent one, the one with steadfast love, the one who never changes? If you want him on your side, we'd like to help you get on his side, and we can tell you how. We're going to sing an invitation song, and during this song, if you'll come forward, we can share with you the next step you need to take in walking with the King. Won't you come right now as we stand and as we sing?